the day to be happy as well. But even better, today we are meet together here for our meeting with family. Family is a blessing for everyone, for sure. And it's a great happiness that we meet together today to start. I'll give just a little introduction, 5 minutes at most, so you'll put hands on. All right, our meeting tonight is the one that comes far, that's from Baltimore, Maryland, from the Spiritist Center, Spiritist Society of Baltimore, SSB, which is Kirsten, DeMelo, and Daniel Santos. Thank you very much for coming, and they were the first ones to introduce our journey towards a happiness family. Please, Kirsten, now.
Good afternoon or good morning. Is it still morning? Good morning. I thank you all for being here. I know it was sometimes difficult for some of us getting up really early in the morning, but how wonderful it is to gather freely, isn't it? I mean, if this were centuries prior and we wanted to discuss topics about Christ, specifically about Christ, we wouldn't have such freedom. We would be hiding away in caverns and under the cover of darkness, having to gather together to talk about Christ-like consciousness or Christ ideas as Christians. But today all we have to do is maybe get up a little bit early, rearrange our schedule, and just make an effort to just appear and come and join. It's something wonderful. Because there's going to be so many dynamics going on today, we decided to do a different type of dynamic. Not to do one where we're having you write, but more so we are having you think and perhaps mold new ideas and new perceptions. And we would say one of a few different things we wanted to do today is to show you this photo. We wanted you to really look at this picture on the screen, not my face, them, and think about what you're looking at. The people in the photo. It's quite obvious what's going on, right? It's obviously a family of many different people. There are discarnates and there are incarnates, right? Could someone tell me, you can just blurt it out, what you think is going on in this photo? A couple is getting married. How do you know that? There's the man and the woman. This is an obvious thing that just jumps out at you, even though I don't have it written there, but it seems as though it's obvious. But actually, this photo for us, even though perhaps the artist who put it together might not have necessarily meant it this way, but this is how we are going to utilize it today for today's topic. This is actually all of humanity, in a sense, because when we talk about nursing our family, we talk about family constellation, as we all are. This is part of the family constellation. When we learn how to nurse something, coming from the field of healthcare, the term nurse is, in actuality, when you nurse someone back to health, you are simply facilitating for the other person to do for themselves. You know, it's like the old saying, teach someone to fish, feed them for a lifetime, but give them a fish, you feed them for a day. So when you nurse something, you are encouraging people to empower themselves. So I digress. In this photo here, we not only see a heterosexual couple, a man and a woman getting married. We potentially, if I had a pointer, if I could point, I'm not sure if this pointer works. It potentially could serve as a man and man or female to female. We point this out because in modern day times, it would be perhaps not wise if I simply address the heterosexual couples, because nowadays there's so many different diverse families that are getting together. We have step parents, we have step children, we have same-sex couples or people who don't have any children at all. We have people who live alone their whole life, have no children. Or there's just so much diversity going on. So we have to remember that in Spiritism, according to the Spirit's book, there is no sectarianism. There is no only man and woman. There is just openness. So when the spirits say that marriage is a union of two souls, they don't specifically say, even though we're not here standing on a soapbox to talk about gay rights and things of that nature, but we learn with Spiritism that, as Kardec has taught us through the spirits, that really Spiritism is so much more broader. It's not about sectarianism. It's not about what the old Christianity has taught us. It's actually much more open. We can read about that in the Gospel according to Spiritism. And that's how one of the many ways Spiritism nourishes our lives, by also teaching us to be more open-minded about the diverse things in our lives that can help teach us. So with that in mind, when we talk about nursing our family, we have to look at the diverse ways in which our families work. So if you live in step families, this applies to you. Whatever type of family dynamic you have, all these things still apply to us. But we also wanted to set the stage a little bit by telling a story that could be your story. It could be our story. It could be somebody you know. But this story is actually in a book that's not yet in English. I'll attempt to pronounce this name. Reportagens de Além Túmulo, Reports from Beyond the Grave, if we could maybe translate that. The story is riveting. Yeah. A couple of the teenagers at our Spiritist Center were having their own little group discussion one day that we overheard. And they were talking about the books that they're reading now, the Harry Potters and other authors I'm not even that familiar with and probably should be. And we kind of got into their conversation and was like, hey, what kind of books you guys like? Mysteries? You like mischievous things and things? Andrea Louise has a whole collection of crazy things that happen, better than Harry Potter. So when this book comes out in English, for sure we can tell our teenagers, you want to hear a really riveting story? Read this book. It's full of stories that will either pull at your heartstring or will shock and awe you. So this story is entitled, we translated the title, The Drama of Andre. And it took place at the end of the 19th century. Typical story about a family, husband and a wife, they get together. Of course, the husband's name is Andre. He gets married. They live in this little town, and they're not rich, they're not high intellectuals, they're just the average couple. And naturally, at some point, they get together, they decide they want to have children. But the interesting thing about Andre is that in the time he was born was when positivism was around. And we would say probably this couple were located somewhere in Brazil. Shot in the dark, but most likely. Because they talk about how Spiritism is growing at that time. So the husband becomes interested in positivism and Spiritism, and then he meets his wife and they get married. So they both have these ideas about spirituality. Yet, when they have children, they have two, Oscar and Leo. And at some point, the husband's constantly at work, and the wife begins to notice that the sons don't have a very good behavior at times. So the mother begins talking to the father, saying, I really think we need to, institute some type of religious activity. Maybe we need to talk to them about God, about morality. And the father is like, I don't know. I don't want my children growing up with this idea of sectarianism and to have these large impediments and things in their lives where they can't move forward. So he's not that impressed, although his wife in the story is very convincing, and he's almost convinced, but he says no. So time goes on, the boys are getting older, and they continue to demonstrate, since at a young age, traits of selfishness, traits of rebelliousness, of which the mother did her best to try to combat it. But by the time these two young boys were teenagers, they were already involved in drugs and lots of things that we hope and pray our children never get involved with. The oldest, Leo, at some point goes to jail and is away for quite a while. And the son Oscar also involved in drugs. And one day when the father was coming home and he's arriving home and he hears his son Oscar screaming and his wife yelling as well, and he runs to the room to see, and he sees his son with his hands on his wife, and he can't believe it. But he sees before him this little monster who used to be his son. So he kicks him out of his home, and that's that. Their oldest son, Leo, also never comes home again, is released from jail at some point. So they're left childrenless. But at that point, Andre realizes that he wasted all those years never teaching his children anything about religion, God, spirituality, that now they are sort of ruined in a sense, but not totally, of course, because we're never lost sheep forever. But he regrets. So they sell everything because they are basically the shameful couple in the town, because everybody, when you live in a small town, everybody knows your business. So they sell their home in hopes to start over, and they move far away to a different location and just start over. Except they really can't start over. Who can live without their children? As bad as our children may be at times, they are still our children, and we still love them, despite the fact of what they may do. So they're heartbroken. They try to go on as normal as they can, and one day, in the middle of the night, the father hears a ruckus downstairs. So naturally, he gets his shotgun, walks downstairs, and sees that there's a man in black, dressed in black, trying to rob him. So he picks up his gun, he aims at him, he shoots him, and the guy just falls to the ground. So he naturally, out of curiosity and wanting to see if the man's all right or what's going to happen, he walks over and sees that it's just a young man. And when he gets even closer and turns on the light, who is it? Oscar. Oscar, my son. Dad. He takes a breath and he dies. His wife, hearing the commotion, comes down the stairs and sees her son in a pool of blood, dead. That had been the first time she had seen her son in many, many years. The couple was so ashamed and so frightened and scared that they didn't tell the police that that was their son who he had kicked out many years ago. The town that he now lived in just figured he was some sort of hero, that he was this great guy who killed the villain, yay! But deep inside, they couldn't bear it. The father went to the police station, took care of things, and when he came back, he found his wife dead. Died of a broken heart. These are not our words, these are the words of this spirit, Humberto de Campos. Some of you may know who he is. But the story doesn't end there. The father, now childless, wifeless, and having no desire to live anymore, sells everything he has again and just meanders about, just walks along the streets, living by the charity of other people, giving him bread and food and clothes at times. And one day he just happens upon a particular city, and he needs to cross this huge lake to get to the next part of the city. So you know how there are these men. I haven't seen it so much here in the U.S., but when I visited Brazil, I saw this, where there are people who, even for free, they just cross you from one side of the river to the next. So that's what had happened. There was a man who was crossing people from one side of the river. So he needed to go to the other side. It was quite dark at night. So he gets on this little makeshift semi kind of boat, gets on, tells him he needs to go to the other side. You know the routine. And as Andre is sitting there on the boat, he's just contemplating his life, what has happened over the years. And he begins to look at the man who's carrying him across the river. And he thinks to himself, wow, if my son Leo, if he's still alive even, he might look like him. So he's just lost in this daydream of his life and his children. And the narrator of the story, Humberto de Campos, switches and lets us know what the boatman is thinking. This young man is looking at this elderly Andrea, thinking to himself, oh, he must have money. I see a wallet. He's plotting in his mind. As Andrea is daydreaming, he's plotting what he's going to do. And he thinks to himself, when I get to the middle of the river, I'm going to grab it, the wallet, throw the old man over. And indeed, that's what happens. As they get to the middle of the river, and Andrea's knee-deep in contemplating about his life, quickly, the boatman grabs his wallet, throws him over, and one last sarcastic comment he makes to him, he says, old man, you don't need this wallet where you're going anyway. And when he says that, and Andrea looks up, he says, Leo, my son, Leo. And Humberto de Campos doesn't say that Leo, who actually is the boatman, doesn't exactly recognize fully that that's his father, but he has a sensation in his heart of regret. So the story ends there. But Humberto de Campos shares a little bit more with us, that sometimes we have this illusion in life of what we want to give our family, of what we want to give our children. We slave over finding the right schools, the charter schools, the magnet schools, making sure our children are dressed nicely, are cleaned up, are bathed, or they follow a regimen, they have the right schedule, they do everything. We make huge efforts in this. Sometimes we take out loans to pay for colleges or schools or private schools. Yet when it comes to the religious or spiritual aspect of our children's lives, we give very little effort sometimes. We don't think it's as important because it's commonplace for us to think about school and things of that nature. As a matter of fact, at least here in the U.S., there are laws in place. If you don't take your children to school, you can get penalized as parents. But there's no moral education that goes on. But believe it or not, even though some of you might think, and oftentimes these are the conversations we have with one another, or perhaps you hear at work, you hear, society is falling apart. Society is going down, marriages are failing, people love to give talks about the divorce rates that exist. But did you know that's actually incorrect? Now, I'm not saying that these statistics that are being regurgitated to you are incorrect, but in actuality, the family unit, the whole as a whole, is actually getting better. Would you believe me if I said that? Yes? Maybe? I'll tell you why. Or rather, Joanna will tell you why. I'm just going to share it with you, what she says. And by sharing, I'm going to tell you yet another case, sort of. Somewhere in Turkey or in one of the Islamic countries, forgive me, I cannot remember at this very moment, there are many young women that are reincarnating in those areas, one of which is named Nijud Ali. She most recently, I'd say in the last few years, became quite famous in a sense, if I could even say famous. Her story became famous. Why? She put together a book, and it's called something like 10 Years Old and Divorced, and she tells about her story, where she comes from. Young women, once they get close to puberty or at puberty, get married off, and sometimes their parents receive money. This is normal, except her story was that she got married, and her husband was supposed to wait for her to reach puberty, as how the cases go. He did not. So I'm looking for children in the audience, he abused her in many ways until one day she said, enough, enough. Now, prior to her, there had been hundreds of thousands of girls that this happened to, and nobody had the courage yet to say, enough. But this little girl, and along with many other little girls that are reincarnating in these areas where the morality and the perception of marriage and unions must change, is evidence that we are changing. So now we think that what goes on in Turkey doesn't affect me because I'm here in the US. We don't have these things that go on here, or wherever country you're from, and we don't have that there. But it does reverberate. So here now in the United States, we see that the issues of gay rights and marriages has been the new thing that's been going on recently. And we think it might not have any connection with what's going on with Nujat Ali and other young girls like her, but it does. I'm going to read you a small text from the book, Family Constellations. It's in the introduction of this book. Allow me to read it. Joanna says the following. Nevertheless, the family has stoically endured the attacks against its institution, and slowly we begin to glimpse a rise in marriages, a resurgence in codes of ethics as divorces decrease, the abiding respect to monogamy, the highest expression of affection in the anthro-social psychological evolution of humanity towards loyalty and respect for one another becomes more prevalent. All that these stories of Nujat Ali and gay rights is giving us a new perspective on what we define family, how we define family, how we view it. Like the first photo I showed you, this, unbeknownst to you, was an exercise in perception. Because when you first look at something, you label it, you take a picture of it, and you hold it for all eternity, and you think that that is its definition. When in fact, we are much more than meets the eye. We see this throughout the codification, that we are much more than what meets the eye. So our family might actually need much more than what we at first perceive. Because we are immortal spirits. We have many incarnations. We all know this. I don't need to go in great depth. I think for the most of us here, we have that very basic knowledge. And that throughout our vast evolution and many incarnations, we evolve, as Joanna says. The family is the result of the spirit's long evolutionary process on its extensive journey through successive reincarnations. So since the animal kingdom, we've been playing house. We've been learning how to live together. You can read more about this in this beautiful book that's in English but not published yet. Evolução em Dois Mundos, Evolution in Two Worlds. It's beautiful. And what's interesting about this book, Evolution in Two Worlds, is that in the introduction, they say that this book is for those who are suffering. Who is not suffering? Who hasn't suffered? We all are. That's why the institution of family is important, because it's there we begin to learn how to love. It's our, as Joanna says, it's our first experience. It's our first relationships we have. You know, there's a pretty famous song by John Mayer. It says, "Fathers, be good to your daughters, because daughters become mothers too." It's very profound, especially for an artist who doesn't have the best reputation. But it is true. And mothers, be good to your sons, because sons become fathers too. So we teach our children good or bad things that they take with them. We know what a family is by definition, thank you to Merriam-Webster, from a materialistic standpoint. But from a Spiritist perspective, we know it is a blessed institution. So when Joanna tells us that it is not the family in and of itself that's the problem, but it's the lack of morality and ethics, the things that we are teaching. And sometimes we don't realize that we are teaching our family. And the other day, one of my coworkers was telling me that she has 2 boys, and the youngest is 2 years old, and she said she couldn't get her iPhone to work, and she was so extremely frustrated, not really realizing that her 2-year-old son was playing beside her. She said, "I'm just going to shoot myself in my head." And then her 2-year-old son said, "Mommy, I'm going to shoot myself in my head." And she said, "Oh my God. I didn't even realize I said that." How many times she said, I had said that to myself. But I didn't mean it. But children are like sponges. This is basic psychology, Psych 101 you learn in any community college. Children are sponges. But what psychology class doesn't tell you is that your children already come with a huge baggage from previous lives. They already have a connection with you. And we learn that there is a reincarnatory plan, that our family group is not a casual encounter, it's not by chance. We all know this. You can read about this in the book Missionaries of the Light, the reincarnation of Segismundo. Beautiful. You can learn how detailed the higher spirits get involved, from the way that you're going to look when you reincarnate, to the family, to what issues you are supposed to work on in this life. So as we are running away from our family obligations because we just can't take our dysfunctional family any longer, think about that. Before reincarnation, the high spirits knew what they were doing when they put you in that so-called dysfunctional family. It's because within that dysfunction can become functional. And we're going to talk about those things today. But did you know, that we are actually built in such a way to live in society, to live in a family? Now, I'm not going to get into all the different areas of the brain. I shall not bore you to death. And I personally can't stand watching people sleep as I stand up here because I feel so terrible. But I will just tell you that the brain is an amazing thing. And we chose an image to sort of help us to understand the different areas of the brain for sight, for visual memory, everything that has to do with communication. How to communicate, to take in information and to put information out, and how to digest that information. What purpose were we given this brain if not to learn how to deal with one another? But the beauty of Spiritism, unlike any other science, is that they talk about love, our emotions, and specifically Joanna de Angelis talks about the necessity of working on our emotions. Now, the brain helps us to process those emotions, but we, the immortal spirit, are the ones to determine how we deal with those difficult emotions, which we will get into. But what if you just want to say, I don't want to deal with my family? You can do that. Many people do. And sometimes they have to because the situation is so caustic and so dangerous that they must leave. In those situations, there's exceptions. Even Joanna de Angelis says that there's exceptions for everything. But if you just want to run away, and if society itself were to do away with family, we already know it's a magnification of selfishness. But we need to live with one another. We need each other. When you're running out of the house because you're in a rush, because we are busy people, thank God sometimes you have either your daughter, or your son, or your partner, or your husband, whomever, to say, hey, where are your glasses? Simple things. Or just to help point out things that you need to work on. You know, allow me to tell a very fast and quick anecdote. Oftentimes when we are mothers, we have this sensation as if we know everything, or perhaps your mother thinks that she knows everything. It just happens sometimes. We're so sorry. But in actuality, we don't. And it's so good when we have people in our lives point those things out. And forgive me again, we don't like sharing too many things because it's Spiritism. It's not about, personal things necessarily as much as it's bringing people together. But truly, I had this impression of myself that I knew a whole lot about motherhood because I had birthed my child. But it's interesting because when I met my husband, I realized there were a lot of things I really didn't know or didn't see. And I'm not supposed to yet because we are not perfect human beings. We don't have the capacity to be the all-knowing like God. So really, we should always have in the back of our mind that instead of fighting people because we are different, in the Spirit spoke Kardec and the spirits talk about antipathy and sympathy. Sometimes it's not that we have a past history. Sometimes we just have different ideas. But if we put down our ego and look at your partner, friend in the spirit, say, okay, well, what do you have to bring to the table? Let's hear it. Let's work on it together. If you switch your perception, it makes a whole difference. You look at it quite differently. And as much as the photo I shared, you look at it differently. We already know about the different types of families that exist. There's blood ties and spiritual ties. This is evidenced by you have friends that are closer to you in your heart than your own blood sister or blood brother, or even your own biological mother. And we know why that happens, because through successive reincarnations, we build affinities with people. This makes sense. But we are brought back again, the majority of the time, into families where there are sometimes just a few issues, sometimes there are a mountain of issues. But it's important to know your role. And Joanna DeAngelis, beautifully, in this book, Family Constellations, if you're not sure, this is a great manual. It's a handbook. It's not just a book to read at night before you sleep. It actually is a book to be studied in depth and to share with others kindly, not to say, hey, Grandma, know your role. It's important for us to know what role we play, especially in the family setting, because Joanna DeAngelis is very clear. And here's where we get into the nitty-gritty of nourishing our families. It will be a series of short, few tips, but they are very rich tips for our lives. So each one of us has a role in the family: grandparents, aunts, uncles, daughters, mothers, father, siblings. But the parents, and I quote Joanna, this is not, although I agree with Joanna, this is her words, the parents are the primary people who are responsible for the moral, spiritual, intellectual education of their children, not the grandparents, not the aunts. Although, naturally, if something happens, if circumstances, whatever they may be, and we need the assistance, that's wonderful. If we have that here, probably most of us have half our family in a different country and maybe just one or two here. Sometimes it's like that. It is what it is. This is your reincarnatory plan. Embrace it. Love it. But it's important to know what our roles are to fulfill it to a T, to the best of our ability. Otherwise, clashes begin to happen, and it's quite common, especially for grandparents to come into our home, or mother-in-laws or things of that nature, or father-in-laws, because mother-in-laws get a bad rap, to come in. And it's natural because we all want to help. But Joanna says they can be as a support system for parents and should be a sort of backup in so many ways. But also they shouldn't be thrown all the responsibility to them. But please, we encourage you to read this and study that book. Because parenthood, in actuality, it's a school. It's a school for us, parents, educators, really. Because we have certain goals as parents. When we talk about the family institution, the family unit, and how to nourish it, we must know our role in that nourishment. When you go to nursing school or when you're a physician, you need to learn your role in that dynamic, because you have a physician, a nurse, a therapist. Each one must fulfill their role appropriately. And for parents, it is to guide their children on the pathway to goodness and morality, to contribute to a better society. I heard once recently on the radio a gentleman say, you know, in the past we used to say, oh, I want to leave a better world for my children. But now what we need to start saying is, I want to leave better children for this world, because it is in our youth that will grow up and create a great world or a not so great world yet. Because the older generation is getting older and sick, and soon will return back to the spirit realm. And the children that were left behind will be the ones to toil in the soil or to make good or not make good. That will be our legacy that we leave behind, is what we give to our children. The other goals that we know as Spiritists is to deal with the issues of past lives, to help our children as well, and for each of us is different, to achieve unconditional love, to transform our corporeal family into our spiritual family. That, I would say, is the whole shebang of our discussion, of our conversation today. That is the idea. You know, we discussed earlier that sometimes we have people in our lives that feel more like family than our own family. That's the idea with our corporeal family, with our blood relations, to make them more of a spiritual family. How do we do that? Do we go to their home, to where they live, and force them to change? Maybe they're not Spiritists. You want to force them to become a Spiritist or force them to do something different? Quite the contrary. I heard a very good friend of mine say to me recently, you know, Kirsten, I always thought my family was a little bit dysfunctional and had issues. And then as I grew up spiritually and I really began to blossom in my understanding of Spiritism and my perspectives changed. When I came back home to visit my family, I saw that they were all changed. And he said to me, I said to my mother, Mom, you guys have really grown and you know, you've become such wonderful people. And she turned to him and said, not really. We're still the same in so many ways, but you have grown. So thus your perspective of us has changed. And he told me that that was quite profound because he hadn't realized that. He lived most of his adult life thinking that he had a really weird family. But he said, maybe I was the weird one. And now that my perspective has changed, I don't think my family's so weird anymore. So it's interesting. Our perspectives play a big role in how we view things. We're getting down to the nitty-gritty here, resolving conflicts. If you don't have any conflicts or never have had any conflicts in your family, could you please raise your hand? I would like you to accompany me during the end of my talk. No, I didn't think so. That's okay. That's great. If conflicts are popping up in your family, in your social circle, that is wonderful. Why is that wonderful? It means that you're progressing. It means that we are progressing. If you were to remain stagnant, it means more than likely you are spiritually blind and don't see what's going on around you. And that is more scary than anything else. But since you all have conflicts, that's wonderful. Great. You guys are not blind. You're open. Conflicts have a very negative rap. We shouldn't look at it as something negative. We should look at it as a challenge to be conquered and to move on to the next one. We found a nifty little tip to help us to resolve conflicts. It's called the ideal model. And it's a little step-by-step process. The next time you have a conflict in your marriage, with your children, in your home, perhaps with your coworker if they're willing to do this, first identify the problem and the feelings of everybody involved in the conflict. There's an interesting books done by a company called the Onion Head Company, and they have a series of cards of emotions. And they're for adults and teens, and they help us to identify different emotions because what research has shown is that so few of us know we have hundreds of thousands of emotions. And probably if I polled you guys, you maybe might be able to give me about 20, maybe 50 if you're really good. I don't think I've ever got more than 50. But that's okay because we're in a learning process. That's totally fine. Don't feel bad about yourselves. We're learning. But it's important to identify what we're feeling to know how to fix it. It's a primary idea in the AA program, right? Acknowledge that there's something wrong to be able to face it. So acknowledge your emotion because our emotions are a guide or a GPS system. They let us know where we are at. But I can't resolve something with you if I don't know how you feel about it, without an ego, without pride. So first we just identify it, determine possible alternatives to the solution, evaluate the alternative solutions, act choosing the best solution, and learn from what you did to solve the conflict. Sounds so easy. Wow, when we read this. Whew. Is it this easy? Nope. I always feel so bad to have to tell people it's going to be a bumpy road. It's going to be challenging. Expect it. Just expect it. Just know it's going to happen. But embrace that. But know that if you keep working at this, things will get better and easier. So you may be saying at this point, is this Spiritist? What is this? Actually, it is. Joanna DeAngelis tells us in the little beautiful book that's published already in English called Happy Life. And she says that when making a decision, we should choose the decision that is least harmful to the other person. So when they talk about acting, choosing the best solution, we can insert Joanna's words there. Choose what is best and least harmful to you and your family, to you and your partner, spouse. In actuality, there's a CD, Joanna DeAngelis, I believe she has a CD, of messages or a visualization, and she talks about this visualization. When we are looking at a problem, we're dealing with a problem, consider the alternatives. So naturally, when we found this, we thought of Joanna DeAngelis because she talks about us opening up our minds, think about the alternatives. Because our problem sometimes is a problem of fixation. Sometimes in our family, we're fixated on one specific problem, and we can't switch it. We can't unfocus our mind unless we make a conscious effort to do so. But Joanna, our sister Joanna, she tells us, the family is a place of collective work where everyone is under the obligation of mutual help. Everyone. Sometimes we relegate that work to our children and think it's our children, they need to change, they need to stop being so rebellious because it's getting on my nerves. We need to work on that emotion as well. Believe it or not, our children were also placed in our lives for us to modify ourselves from the inside out. But what about when we have challenging family members? So we know about resolving conflicts. You already know that you're born into the correct family because you are to resolve conflicts and issues from perhaps previous lives. But how do you deal with those who really are just very difficult and challenging? Joanna has a tidbit for us. She says, unable to adjust yourself to the general program, or this family member is unable to adjust themselves, don't exclude them from the group. They require understanding. Avoid antipathy or hostility, be it of a hidden or declared nature. It's interesting because we were learning recently about the animals. And sometimes what happens is that we were watching something on the TV the other day, actually on Netflix, about kittens. And this mother had a litter of kittens, and there's always like the runt of the litter. But what happens instinctually when a mother notices that there is one kitten out of her 10 litter, or her litter of 10 rather, she just puts it aside. She doesn't make an effort because instinctually she knows that that one kitten isn't worth compromising the rest, so she'll let it die. It's a natural instinct. So that instinct, we think, goes away once we become at the level of humans. In actuality, it doesn't. Remnants of that same instinct to put aside the runt in our family, the one that's just weird or strange or difficult or challenging, we want to just put them away sometimes. And Joanna says sometimes it's of a hidden nature. Sometimes it's obvious. We very blatantly wish to push aside that one particular family member. But sometimes it's very hidden. We try to put on a facade for others or sometimes for ourselves. But she says, don't do that. Don't exclude them. They're placed in your family for a purpose. Much like Andrea, he wanted to just push his children away because he didn't like the little monsters he himself had helped create. When he should have done the opposite, tried to do his best to rectify what he himself had helped create. But how do we nourish our families? So we learn about resolving conflicts. We learn that we shouldn't put away the challenging ones. We've learned that we are born into the family that we need to be in. Everything's on purpose. We learn that there are higher spirits that come and put together our reincarnatory plan. But what do we do? How do I nourish this supposed dysfunctional family? What if I am a child? I'm a sister, I'm a brother, or I am the parent, or I'm the step-parent. What do we do? Aside from prayer, which we'll get into that as well, we have other little tidbits. And we're going to have a little marriage ceremony, metaphorically speaking, between these two books. One, naturally, is amazing. Both are amazing in their own way. But this book, perhaps, it might not be too well known to you. It's by a psychologist, Dr. Richard Carlson. It's called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff with Your Family. He made a series of books, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff in Love, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff for teens as well. It's really great. Years ago, we actually came upon this book. It was a gift that our father had received and had just thrown it to the side. Thought it was an interesting looking book, wanted to see what you shouldn't be sweating, and found the book to be quite interesting. Forgot about the book. Years later, came upon it after we began reading and studying much more about Spiritism and realized, oh my goodness, the very things that are talked about in this book, we've read about in the books of Joanna de Angelis and the Codification. The very tips that they give are so similar. It's as if he went to the same school that Joanna de Angelis was teaching on the other side. Probably he did. There are many psychologists that have reincarnated on the earth that Joanna de Angelis herself has spoken of, and it seems as if they've come from the same school. So one of the first tips that this particular psychologist talks about in terms of nourishing our families, he says that think of taking care of your home like painting a bridge. When we were developing this talk and we were discussing about this issue of painting a bridge and reading a little bit about how to paint a bridge, it actually takes a tremendous amount of work. In actuality, they're constantly fixing things throughout the year. There's never a time period where they might go 6 months without it. You're constantly working on little things, repainting it here and there. It's a lot of work. But what's interesting is one thing that my partner in crime had mentioned to me was that, you know what's interesting, when we think about why the psychologist chose the image of a bridge, is that at any moment it could fall or we could fall. It's much like our family. When we think we're trying to mend things, at any moment, in a snap, things can change. And we have to learn how to adjust. And Spiritism comes and teaches us how to make those adjustments within ourselves. But think of taking care of your family like painting a bridge, that it takes daily nourishment to feed our family. What does that mean? Okay, tip number one, or tip one of many. Create a positive routine in your family that's revolved around connecting with the higher power. For instance, you might create a routine where every morning you pray together. That's a form of nourishment that you're giving to your children and to yourself. You are then taking care of your family like you take care of a bridge. Joanna de Angelis, in this beautiful book, Family Constellations, gives her tips on how to nourish our families. Holding our gospel at home or God at home, however you want to term that, weekly. If you don't know what that is, please come and see us afterwards, where I'm sure you could speak to the directors of this beautiful center about what that means. But those God at home meetings are much more powerful than we could ever imagine. And it's quite interesting because in Family Constellation, it's the first place I've ever read someone talk about these gospel or God at home meetings in such a profound way. We grew up having our gospel at home, where all we did was just discuss. We opened up the gospel according to Spiritism. We spoke about only that which was on the book, and that was it. We weren't allowed to bring up anything else. That was just commonplace. But Joanna de Angelis comes and gives it a facelift. She gives our gospel at home a spiritual facelift, and she says, your gospel or God at home should serve as a time in your family where your loved ones are free to talk about their feelings in a respectful way, to talk about the issues that are going on, perhaps with your children at school, perhaps your husband, and correlate it with the topic at hand, because we always can. There's always something going on. Sometimes our daughter might talk about the little boy who has cancer in class, and Mommy, what's going to happen to him when he dies? Because his mommy is here. Who's going to meet him? So it's a great opportunity to bridge these issues with our children, or perhaps just with our own selves. If you are single or widowed or what have you, or have this choice to live on your own, which is totally fine, but have your own God at home meetings, and you'll be surprised how much more enlightened you'll feel. Joanna teaches us that, and let's just read it directly. She says, as a fundamental element of education, religious orientation in the family has become indispensable. The child will absorb the learning, which must always be followed by the actual living of the teachings on the part of the parents. So we place the seeds in our child's soul, in their being. So even if they don't grow up and become spiritists, but if they grow up and become good people, or less ignorant and more open, you've done a wonderful job. And at the appropriate time, somewhere in their immortal lives, the seeds will germinate when they are supposed to. So Joanna Giannis tells us that in methodology to family education, the study of the gospel of Jesus at home is a significant resource that contributes to the balance of all family members. So what does that mean? You might say, oh, I have a husband, he's not Spiritist, or I have a wife, or I have a partner, or I have a roommate. It's okay, that doesn't matter. You could still do your meeting, and it will affect your home in a positive sense. In the Genesis, Kardec talks about, he explains about prayer, how it creates this force around you. So imagine if you're praying in your home, you create this protection. Throughout the codification in Andrea Louise, they give these tales of people who do their gospel or God at home, and how it creates this protection, and how certain spirits of a lower order are unable to penetrate because there is this protection around your home. So regardless of who believes or what they believe, this blessing of protection will still fall upon you or be around you. So it is contributing to the balance, and you also begin to attract higher minds to your home because you begin to set off this light. So it has effects that we don't even see or perhaps can't even perceive. This is interesting as well. When we read in this particular book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, remember to show your appreciation, Dr. Carlson says. It's very important. Anything, he says, from saying thank you to sending thank you cards to do nice things to others. We're talking about in your family. I'm not just talking about when you have a baby shower and you send out thank you cards. It's normal, at least here in the U.S. it is. But when your partner, spouse, child does something, you say thank you. So it's interesting because there was a book published. Once again, we are utilizing our dear. As you can see, we sort of have a liking of Joanna Giannis's books. She published a book through the mediumistic hands of Divaldo Franco called The Psychology of Gratitude. It is in English. It's an amazing book when you read it because she says we should be grateful for our ancestors. So when we read that, we thought, well, what does she mean by that? She goes on to talk about how, and I'm going to paraphrase, for instance, I live in the U.S., I grew up here. I know my founding fathers, I know who they are, I know what they did to make this land free. She says we should be grateful for those minds that came before us. So our gratitude is not just for right here, right now, but it's for the hard work of all the pioneers. So when you go to Brazil or other countries where Spiritism is slightly more widespread, and you see that there are Spiritist centers in every street corner, I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but we should be grateful for the pioneers who first came to Brazil, a lot of them from Italy, some of them other lands, some not, but worked hard to plant the seed. Many people don't know about the great pioneer Eurípides Barçanufo. Many people don't know. He's not widely talked about as Chico Xavier, who's equally as wonderful. But these are pioneers who pave the roads for us, for you. And now in this country, there are pioneers that are trying to pave the road so our children's children can be free to discuss these ideas. Unlike my generation, who you go to school and nobody knows what a Spiritist is. What is that? You're either a Catholic or you're Jewish. Maybe you might be a Buddhist, but not a Spiritist. Nobody knows what that is. You're relegated to the side, my friend. But we hope that what we're doing is so our children in the future can be more free to discuss these ideas, to feel more part of a whole of a generation that wants to believe in something more. So let us show our appreciation. And let us set an example always, be it an example of peace. And just earlier today, Daniel was calling someone the bombero, the fireman, talking about a gentleman here who has a historical history of being the peacemaker. That's great. People know him as that person. We want that. We want to be that person who is the peacemaker in our family, who tries to cool down the flames. Guys, let's just get it together. Let's be cool. Even if you've never been there, even if you were the person who was the fire maker, did you know that you can now be the person who puts out the fire? Because we can. But it's hard to put out fires in our family when we have bitterness and resentment in our hearts that we've been holding on to, either from this life or from many other lives. But she says, love, fraternity, and sincere conversations, along with the exercise of respect and understanding towards one another, we are emotionally linked to. In the Spirits book, I believe it's question 812 or 811, when Kardec asked the spirits, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, will the equality of well-being be will be equal for everyone one day? And the spirits answer, relatively speaking, because everyone's happiness and definition of happiness is different, but we all can be relatively happy in accordance to our own definition if we also would respect the law of justice, the spirits say. So of course we had to go back and study, well, what is the law of justice? It means to respect one another. Respect that people are different. In our family constellation, we are all different. Respect our differences. Respect their differences. Even if they don't respect yours, because you will be an example for somebody else. In chapter 19 of Action and Reaction, a book that was psychographed by Chico Xavier, by the Spirit Andrea Luis, Mentor Druso talks about mental renewal as a most needed tool for all of God's creatures. More so, actually, I should say, us humans who have constant thought, unlike the animals. So we need this mental renewal. You can read more about it. But when Dr. Richard Carlson says, create a new relationship with someone you already knew, is this form of renewal, letting go of old hurts, sources of anger, expectations, and total forgiveness and complete willingness to start over. Forgiveness is a whole other topic we could talk about, because that's hard to let go of the hurts. But the only step you need to make is a desire to want to move on with your life, to do better. Like Nujid Ali, she wanted better for herself and other young little girls. But Joanna gives us another tip. When we're dealing and experiencing issues within our family, the partners have the obligation to stop the distancing that insinuates itself by means of a mature psychological cohabitation and seek the middle path, compromise, through an honest dialogue in the effort towards the reestablishment of joy and happiness at home. What does that mean? Learn to talk to one another, whether it's to our partner or to our children. Let us learn to have a better conversation. And today, no doubt, you will have lots of little tidbits of how to have better conversations, how to talk more calmly, maturely with one another. And through that, we can learn. because our family is a permanent training camp where feelings and emotions are stirred toward the positive creation of future projects. We don't live in an ideal family that we wish for. We come to a group in which our evolutionary needs are addressed. So if we look at that perspective instead of looking at what we wish for, it would at least help us to deal better and be more inclined to nourish our family. Because if you look at something as, well, I need to learn something from this, let me do my part. Whether you are the child, whether you are the parents, or the aunt or the uncle, just do your part. That's all that God asks of us, is simply to do our part. This is just to remind us of the tools for spiritual success. Our God at home, the perfect opportunity for us to talk about what's going on in our lives, or perhaps with one another. Prayer. It's interesting. We are deeming this a form of spiritual hygiene. And Joanna DeAngelis, in the introduction, I believe it is, she talks about this need. We always vaccinate our children. The most of us, I think we do. We go at the appropriate times, we vaccinate, but yet we don't think about the spiritual vaccinations we need to give to our children and teach them how to vaccinate themselves through prayer, through protecting themselves, through being observant of their thoughts. It's not something we routinely teach our children, but we should. At night, we can talk to them, ask them, how was their day? How did you feel throughout the day? What kind of thoughts did you have? Because there you begin to create a routine. And over years, they will always begin to have this. When they move away from home and go to college, they'll remember that. That at night, or whatever time is appropriate, they begin to think about the thoughts that they have, to pray, to clean away that negative energy. It's a way to vaccinate our children as well. Spiritual education, what does that mean? Bringing them to church, to a Spiritist center, some activity outside of the home. How often is prenatal education talked about? We don't think about that too much. Well, yes, we do. Woman goes, you go to prenatal classes, you go to Lamaze classes. But do we have a prenatal education, spiritually speaking? Do we teach the mothers to talk to their spirit that's about to be incarnating, to prepare that spirit, to encourage that spirit? Do we know that our words during the prenatal time have an effect on our children? There's a true case that Givaldo tells that a woman who had, I think, a 3 or 4-year-old daughter who hated her mother, and she was at her wit's end, and she said, Givaldo, I don't know what to do anymore. My daughter hates me. She doesn't let me put her to bed. I can't give her a bath. She's repulsed by me, and I don't know why. So he said, my sister, I don't know myself. I can console Joanna, and I'll get back to you. So sometime later, she came again to Givaldo, and Givaldo said, look, Joanna told me to tell you what happened during your pregnancy. And she said, Givaldo, my pregnancy was fine. I didn't have any problems. And he said, I don't know what to tell you. This is what Joanna's telling me. So the woman goes home again and thinks about what happened during her pregnancy. And there was a time during her pregnancy, I believe, if I'm not messing up the story, but you guys won't really know. But let's just say she said something to the effect of that she wasn't ready for this baby, or she didn't want it at that moment. But it passed and she accepted it. So later she came back again to Givaldo and told her, Givaldo, I know what it is. And so he confirmed with Joanna, yes, that's what it is. And he said, Joanna wants me to tell you that it's okay. Your child is still young. You can fix the damage that you placed upon her psychologically and emotionally. Every night, you lay with her, you talk to her, you tell her that you're glad she's reincarnated as your child. You love her. You embrace this plan of reunion. So our prenatal education is vital. And if you think, I had those thoughts when I was pregnant and my child's 20 years old, it's okay. You can still love your children. You can still tell them every day. It's never too late. It's never too late to apply tips, to apply simple things in our lives. We are never so far gone. Read the books of Andrea Louise. We are never too far gone. Read the book Liberation. You'll learn about Gregorio. He was really far gone, and he came back to the light. Because our ultimate goal is to take this corporeal family and learn to love our greater family all across the globe. That is the idea, because it's very difficult to conquer problems on the outside if I can't conquer the little problems at home. It's an illusion that we have. So I hope today we have unveiled some things, unmasked, given a facelift, some words of encouragement to start again, to start anew. I thank you so much for having me. God bless you all.